I'm a retired police officer, and some of the stories I could tell would make everybody respect us, and what we go through daily so much more. It was a truly thankless job. Nobody likes a police officer, but you need one when you need one. I will admit there were bad apples in our department, but most of my fellow officers get into their careers to help people and protect their community. I have had some unbelievable experiences, but I've only had one truly paranormal experience that made me a believer. There are things that can't be explained. There's no such thing as coincidences, and we don't understand everything that's going on in this world. One night, I received a call about an elderly woman hearing someone trying to break into her house through her attic. I put on my lights and siren and headed there as fast as I could. When I got there, she frantically swung open the door and screamed, "Thank God you showed up. Thank God you came." I ran over to her and asked where the burglar was coming from. She showed me the attic door and I crawled up to see what was going on. I searched that entire attic and didn't find anything out of the ordinary. There were boxes piled up and some pieces of furniture, but not a person trying to break into the house. There were no signs of human entry, and the window up there was locked, so I climbed back down the ladder. I told the woman that she should get an exterminator because if she heard something, it was more than likely an animal. There was no way anybody was up there. She insisted that it was a person trying to get in, and even claimed that it was talking to her, saying things like, "I'm going to get you, and let me out." Just to give her some peace of mind, I went up there and looked around for a while. I checked every square inch of that attic and even opened the boxes and looked inside. It is amazing what kind of junk people save. I crawled back down the ladder and assured her that she is perfectly safe and that I didn't find a single living thing up there. She started crying and pleading with her through the night to save her from whatever was trying to get her. I suggested that she stay with a friend or family member and told her I had to respond to another call. That woman kept calling 911 repeatedly that night and continued doing so every day after that. I would go by and check on her once a day, and she would be hysterical every time I saw her telling me of some of the things that the person up there threatened to do to her. The threats she would describe kept getting more and more gruesome, and she didn't seem like the type to use that type of vocabulary, but I kept going up into the attic to appease her and finding absolutely nothing. Weeks passed, and this became a regular part of my job, and it was starting to wear on me. I explained to her that I could be out there helping people that really need it instead of going up in her attic, but she was adamant that something was up there. I'll tell you something though, I never thought she was doing it for attention. I did figure that she was getting older and more senile and was imagining things, but I believed that she was experiencing something awful. I recommended she talk to a psychiatrist and told her to get a paranormal investigator to look at her attic. I didn't believe in any of that stuff then, but I was desperate to help her get some relief, and I was really getting sick of going over there so needlessly. She agreed to do both, and I went to respond to another call. The next time I saw her, she told me that the paranormal investigators told her it was the most amount of activity they had documented in over 5 years. This actually freaked me out, and I went back up into the attic again. I felt something sinister in that attic, but I kept telling myself that it was just my imagination reacting to what she had told me. Loudly enough for the lady to hear, I kept repeating, "If you're not here for her greatest good, leave now and forever, and the power of Christ compels you." Both of these I had heard in movies about exorcisms, and was mainly just doing so she would believe that the spirits were gone. I left after a while, and she thanked me over and over again on my way out. That night she was brutally mutilated and murdered in her sleep. To this day, it's the most horrific crime I've ever witnessed. She was stabbed over 100 times all over her entire body. Her face was unrecognizable, some of her organs were pulled out of her, and many other details I won't share and get nauseous thinking about. Forensics couldn't find a single piece of evidence, and the lady was beloved in the community. We couldn't figure out a single person that would want this done to her, and our community is still devastated by this tragedy. One thing that still actively haunts me is that the attic door was wide open on the night she was murdered. I know I closed it after me when I left that night, and she was too tiny to have opened it by herself. It could just be a coincidence, that's what I've told myself multiple times, but it's the worst thing I've ever seen, and I don't know how any person could have done something like this. I've never talked to anyone who had anything bad to say about her, and there are so many stories of her changing people's lives for the better. The feeling in that attic that night, along with the paranormal investigators' claims, was enough to make me more of a believer. The brutality of the murder and the attic being open made me completely trust the poor lady's story, and I do believe that the paranormal entity that kept threatening her finally followed through with its promises. This one goes way back to 1999 when I first moved to Los Angeles and took a job with the city sewer department. Most people know by now that there have been colonies of homeless people living underground in the sewers of major cities for a long time. This isn't new information or unique to Los Angeles, as sad as it may be. An unfortunate part of working for Public Works in the sewer department, though, is that occasionally we have to run into these parts of the system and flush out these people. For the most part, they aren't hurting anything, but these colonies do tend to develop their own set of laws that can lead to some pretty dire and dangerous situations if they aren't reminded on occasion that people are keeping an eye on them. One way to do this is to break up the colonies now and again by forcing them to relocate. Of course, nobody likes running people out of their homes, no matter how unseemly those homes may be, but there are kids and elderly people down there too, so you have to try to maintain a certain level of civilization, and at the very least, know what's going on. This particular day would be my first time being assigned that task, and also my last. That morning, I was already dreading the task for the simple fact that it did involve stomping around in the sewers and dealing with unpleasant people in unpleasant situations. I was warned the day prior that I'd be traveling down with a coworker named Rodney to learn how to perform the task, though, and Rodney had always seemed like a pretty solid character, so I was a little bit encouraged in that sense. When I reported to work, Rodney was already getting ready to head out. As I walked in, he gave me a once look over and asked me if I was sure I was ready for all this. I told him I was as ready as I'd ever be, and he tossed me a headlamp. He said to me, "You're not going to believe what you see down there, so just be ready for anything." I shrugged it off. I'd grown up in tough neighborhoods and seen just about anything that I was imagining we'd find down there. Drugs and violence, homelessness and broken families. If you could rattle it off as a stereotype of poor upbringing, I had seen or lived it firsthand myself. I wasn't worried. He didn't seem to like that I was so casual about the situation, though. He got a little more stern with me. He said, "I mean what I'm telling you. Once we're down there, I need to know you're going to keep your head on straight." I couldn't help but laugh. He seemed to be making this whole thing a lot more dramatic than it needed to be. "There's a reason they're sending you with me and nobody else," he said. I let my curiosity get the better of me. "What's that?" I asked, half expecting him to rattle off some crap about being former law enforcement or military, whatever his reason was for having such an inflated ego about the whole ordeal. "Because I'm the only one that can deal with those things and not get scared," he said. Now my curiosity was piqued. Things? What the hell did he mean by those things? We were heading down to deal with people as far as I knew. I didn't say another word after that for a while. I just watched Rodney and did everything he did. I have to admit I was a little spooked thinking about what he might mean. After all, we've all heard the urban legends of baby alligators getting flushed down the toilets and rats the size of dogs. I was actually beginning to wonder if I should have brought my gun. We made our way down the manhole and started down one long tunnel. He sort of glanced back over his shoulder and said, "I can smell them." "You smell that?" We were in a sewer, so I was hesitant to take a sniff, but I did anyway out of pure curiosity. The smell reminded me of my little brother's pet turtle tank when we were kids, that musty, mildewy smell of reptiles and stagnant water. I asked Rodney, "The people down here smell like that?" I still wasn't clear on what we were doing. He kind of chuckled and explained to me, "Before we can talk to the people down here, we have to get permission to look for them." Permission? What was he talking about permission? And from whom? "There they are," he said, and I looked down the tunnel. At least a dozen pairs of eyes were reflecting back the light of our headlamps as we got closer. I started trembling and wanted to turn and run back, but I wasn't about to make an embarrassment of myself in front of Rodney. As we got closer to the eyes, I was surprised to find that they all looked very much like people. They weren't attractive people, I'll give you that much. They all had sort of bulging eyes and thin lips. What I could see of ears were all oversized and a bit pointed, but to catch any of them up on the surface, you'd think they were just ugly humans. One of them approached Rodney and they had a sort of hushed conversation. I stood back and waited, not sure what to make of the situation. As I waited, a child emerged from behind the group and approached me. When she got close enough, I could see that her eyes were a funny yellow color and her pupils looked like slits. As unsettling as all of it was, they didn't seem malicious, and as soon as Rodney was finished talking to the guy, we took off down another tunnel to search for the homeless colonies. Later on, I'd ask him, "What was all that about?" He just shrugged. "I don't know where they came from. I just know they're in charge down here. It's best to not ask any more questions." So I didn't. I just turned in my notice the next day and got out of town. I live in Northern Virginia and used to love going out and exploring some of the lesser-known spots in the area. There's a park that almost no one knows about that's a real throwback to pre-Civil War times. There are completely untouched antebellum homesteads. There's a Revolutionary War wagon route and old Civil War trenches and quite a few random graves. I'm fascinated with that era of time, so it was always interesting to look around there. It's all located along a trail behind fancy neighborhoods and golf courses. The trail's over 20 miles long. But I guess most people don't have time for that kind of history. I was there one day and came upon an old brick chimney. There was no sign of the house that used to surround it, just the chimney. It was in a kind of clearing that surprisingly didn't look very overgrown. And there was a little hearth in front of the chimney with a small stone fireplace opening. What struck me was how clean it looked, like someone had swept it recently. I poked around and spotted a little trail at the edge of the clearing. I followed it into the woods about 100 feet and came to where there was about a 3-foot-tall stone wall marking out a rectangular piece of property. On one edge, I found this old stairway leading down to what I assumed was a stone cellar. There was a wooden door down there that was a little propped open. It started to feel a little creepy, but I was so fascinated and couldn't help but go down to take a look. I pulled the door open and turned on my flashlight. There was a wooden table and a couple of chairs. There were wooden shelves against the walls. I saw old glass jars of food on the shelves. Looked like flour and cornmeal and seeds and such. There were a few piles of stuff, old rags and clothes. I started thinking that maybe somebody was squatting there. I shined my flashlight around and saw that the cellar extended far back, and there was a short passage that led to another area. I went through to a small room. It was mostly dirt, more like a hidey hole than anything. There was this black powdery stuff on the floors against the walls. In one spot, there was a little pile that looked like old rotten fruit. I didn't know what to think. I kept wondering if it was a person or an animal who'd been hanging out there. I didn't have much more time to explore that day, so I left and headed home. It was probably about a month later before I was back in that area. I'd had a hard day at work, and it always calmed me down to get out on the trail and let go of some stress. I'd found what looked like an old family graveyard, and I was trying to read the names and dates. Some of the names were so faded, but I got really into trying to figure out some of the family history. It had gotten later than I realized and was starting to rain. I wasn't prepared with a hat or raincoat or anything. But this graveyard was really close to that old chimney I'd found before. I decided to go wait it out in that cellar since I was at least a mile from my car. I was sure it wouldn't rain for long. I found the chimney without any trouble and headed for the cellar. The door was a bit open like before, and I went in and sat in one of the chairs. I always carry a notebook and pen, so I pulled those out and my flashlight and started making some notes. Part of me always thought I'd eventually write a little history book of the area. I was there less than half an hour when I started hearing some rustling noises. I thought maybe there was an animal down the passageway in the little room. It was just soft rustling at first, so I'm thinking maybe some mice or something. But then the rustling got pretty loud, and I thought I heard a weird flapping sound. By then I was freaking out, thinking it was a bat or something. I stuffed my things in my pockets and headed for the door. I was glad it had stopped raining. I made sure to leave the door open and went up the stairs. It was around dusk, but I was curious about who was in there, so I went and sat on the stone wall farthest from the cellar. I hoped whatever it was would come out. I didn't really think it would, but after about 10 minutes, something opened the door further, and I saw this shadowy shape. Okay, I was really freaking out now because it was something big, like 5 or 6 feet tall. Before I had much time to think, it jumped up all the steps at once. It turned its head toward me, but I didn't see any face. But I did see these horrible red eyes that looked like they were glowing and looking right at me. I tried getting to my feet and just tumbled backwards off the wall. I crouched down there looking over, and I kid you not, this thing spread out these huge, black, leathery-looking wings and half jumped and half flew up into the trees. Oh my freaking God. I split out of there, running as fast as possible toward my car. I'm no runner, and by the time I got there, I thought I was going to die. I finally calmed down enough to drive, but all I could think on the way home was how I'd been in the cellar with that thing only like 10 feet away from me. How could something like that be real? I never went back there again. I had this weird encounter back when I was a lot younger and was just a free spirit looking for adventure. I have never been able to find an explanation for it. I figured this was as good a place as any to put it out there. I used to love going out solo camping. This one time I was camped out at Rio Grande Gorge up near Taos, New Mexico. There's no human activity at night, but during the day Manby Hot Springs is pretty busy. I had gone to the springs, and then I had spent the day wandering around on the west rim of the gorge. I had just got back to my campsite, which was close to the Rio Grande River. I got my camping stove lit and boiled some water for my ramen, and was watching the sunset over the rim of the gorge. After eating, I was about to nod off, but I got the feeling I wasn't alone. I figured I was just being paranoid, so I just stayed there half asleep. Being October, it was pretty chilly after the sun went down, so I was bundled up in a down bag and had a hoodie on. I had no tent. I was just cowboy camping. I think I remember feeling a wet nose against my cheek first, before I felt claws on my thighs. 2 badgers had crawled onto my lap and were checking me out. Badgers are fine from a distance, but up close at night, they were terrifying. I screamed and jumped up, and they just looked back at me. The little bastards wouldn't leave, so I started scooping water out of the river and throwing it at them. This made me cold, and I think it amused them more than it scared them away. But they didn't get any closer after that, so I decided I didn't care. Still, I had had a bit of a fright, and my imagination was going a bit crazy, so sleep was not going to happen. They had backed off, so I got back in my bag and leaned against a rock trying to fall asleep. It wasn't really that late, but I was tired from hiking all day and I really didn't want to stay up all night dealing with critters. I was trying to settle myself down when I noticed a faint blue glow coming from somewhere far up the gorge. The blue glow got much brighter over a short span of time and seemed to be accompanied by a low buzzing sound. It was a weird blue. Not white blue like moonlight. Not bright blue like emergency lights. It was kind of like the color when you're underwater in a swimming pool at night. I was pretty interested by this point, and already freaked out by the badgers, but I brushed it off. But the glow seemed to be slowly getting closer and the buzzing was getting louder. The blue never got any brighter, but it seemed to get clearer. It's hard to describe because what happened next dominates my memory of the next several minutes so strongly that I'm not sure what happened right before it came around the bend in the gorge. What I saw was a wall of blue light moving between each of the walls of the gorge, but I couldn't tell if it ended with the river water or extended into the river. The buzzing was definitely coming from the wall of blue light, or slightly above it. I had no clue what was happening, but I had the feeling that I should get out of the gorge before it got much closer. I grabbed my gear and threw everything into my backpack and went along the river until I got to the bridge across the river. I had no car because a friend had driven me up from Albuquerque and dropped me off. I got to the bridge and there was an old man on a horse. He was wearing a black cowboy hat and a poncho. He was just parked there on his horse looking north. Looking at the wall of light, I yelled out, "Hey!" but I got no response from him. At that point, I'm starting to question my sanity or sobriety. I had been drinking a little earlier, but I wasn't usually a lightweight. I started to run along the road to the east, along the river to hopefully get somewhere more normal. The buzzing was getting louder. I looked back and I was only about 20 yards away from the bridge. It had seemed like I'd been going for much longer. The man on horseback finally looked at me. Our eyes met. I felt really freaked out. I felt like I was not supposed to be there. I started walking backward, keeping my eyes on the bridge. The wall of light had kind of gone around the corner where two canyons intersected. I couldn't exactly see it directly anymore. I was fixated on this old man on horseback and trying to fight my urge to turn my back to him and run as fast as I could. I saw him raise a hand and hold his palm out to the light. It stopped immediately. The buzz faded away and a stream of blue light shot up into the sky. I looked back and the old guy had disappeared. I mean, it is possible that he just galloped out of there on his horse and shot up the steep canyon on the other side of the bridge. But that seems unlikely. It was like he just disappeared into thin air. I walked about 5 miles that night and finally hitched a ride back into Taos and checked myself into a motel in the morning. I don't know what the hell I saw that night, but that was incredibly surreal. I'm a student worker at the Ohio State University Main Library, officially known as the William Oxley Thompson Memorial Library. This thing is huge. 11 floors, which are mostly stacks, meaning rows and rows of bookshelves. You can stand on the bottom floor and look up at all those books, which is not good if you have vertigo. I'd been working there for a few months before I noticed anything unusual. I mostly reshelved returned books, so I spent a lot of time walking around in the stacks, pushing a book cart. One day, though, the student who normally helped the librarians close up was sick or something, so I had to stay late. It closes at midnight, and by then hardly anyone's around. A few really dedicated graduate students. There's a ton of lights in the library because, like I said, it's huge. So they start turning them off before closing, and around that time the workers walk around to make sure no one's still inside before locking the doors. It's a little creepy, to be honest, because during the day, light comes from the big windows and the skylights, but at night, it's a lot darker. As I was walking around, I saw a light at the end of a row of bookshelves. It was bright but flickering like a candle. I'll admit I was scared. I didn't want to confront some weirdo who was lighting candles in the library. When I got closer, though, it flickered again and went out. I reached the spot where I thought it was coming from, and I saw nothing. I figured it was just some weird thing, or maybe I was imagining it. But then, that student, the one who was supposed to close normally, she quit. Just up and left OSU. So naturally, I was put on that shift. Now I had to close on every shift I worked, which was 3 days a week. I'd pretty much forgotten about the light, but as soon as I walked up to that same place on the 5th floor and saw it again, I remembered. It disappeared again when I got close. I don't know what was going on, but after that, other weird stuff started happening with the lights. They would follow me, going on as I walked and then off as I passed. One far away would flicker and then go out. Finally, I asked one of the librarians why the other student quit. She said she was scared of something but wouldn't talk about it anymore. I wanted to keep my job, so I didn't push it. I looked up some stuff on ghosts, trying to find out if it was a ghost, how I could make it go away. But all of them said you had to know something about the person, the dead person, before you could really do anything. I started sneaking off to spend part of my shift looking at old copies of the campus newspaper. I'd grab a volume and flip through a few pages whenever I got the chance. It was slow work since I had no idea what I was looking for. But one day, as I flipped through one of the yellowing bound volumes, I felt something like a flash of lightning in my head. The story in front of me was about a girl who was caught burning candles in the library. This was in the 1970s, before the renovation of the library in 1977 that I'd seen mention of in other issues of the paper. The article noted that she'd been found dead outside the library, and people were speculating that she'd been conducting satanic rituals with the candles. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, but no cause was listed. I turned forward through the next few issues, but there weren't any other stories, which told me they never found out how she died. At least that was my guess. So I had some information, but I still didn't know how to get rid of her ghost. If it was her, and if I could do it, both big ifs. I did some more research, and people always said ghosts need closure, but there was no way I could figure out who killed her, if someone did, way back in 1973. There was one idea that might work, though, I thought, and that was making an altar. Well, not really an altar, like one of those roadside memorials, with pictures and flowers and stuff. So I photocopied the picture of her from the paper and got some fake flowers. There are always bookshelves in big libraries like that aren't full. I found one in the most remote part of the library, the very back in a corner, and put a little memorial there. I even found a little angel statue and stuck it with the other stuff. I don't know if ghosts can sense stuff like that, so I made sure that night when we were shutting down to walk to the memorial. And yeah, the lights were turning on in front of me and off behind me. This time, now that I knew, or at least thought I knew what it was, it seemed less creepy. Almost just like someone walking there, except I couldn't see them. When I got to the memorial, the lights flickered. I walked away without looking back, and the lights stopped following me. After I was pretty far away, I turned and looked back. I saw that bright candle-like light seeming to hover near that shelf where the memorial was. The next night, I walked around and didn't see any weird stuff with the lights at all. It was strange, almost sad, like I almost missed it. When I went to where the memorial was, it was gone. Maybe the janitor picked it up, or maybe something else happened to it. I don't know. But I never saw that flickering light again.